So here's what he had to say. There's one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. You know what I think is interesting about that line there is toward the end when it says, or says he believes. And that's what I hope we kind of uncover and talk about today. And that is that people can say it over and over again that they don't think there's such a thing as truth, but they can't live it. And so we want to, in a sense, confront people and show them that you don't really believe that. And we'll talk about reasons why in a few minutes. So how did, let me ask you, how did truth used to be defined?
The Word of God.
Well, Word of God, okay. But let's say Christian or non-Christian, just anybody, anywhere. Trace?
That which aligns with reality.
That which aligns with reality, telling it like it is. They call that the correspondence theory of truth. So in other words, if I say there are 26 people in the room here, I made a claim, right? So we could go around, we could count, and if there are 26 people, what I said corresponds to the reality of that. Or if I say we've had 8 inches of rain in Escondido over the last, whatever, seems like it, you know, you could check that out, right? There's a weather service somewhere and it'll tell you how many inches we got. So that was the definition, right? When things are the way that you say they are. Pretty simple. Doesn't seem like it's that hard. That's what we usually mean, telling it like it is. That was truth. What's happened to truth, though? What's the new definition? This is the one that we have to really make some headway against.
Everyone has their own truth.
Everybody's got their own truth. Truth has changed from what's out there. It's become subjective. In other words, it's inside the subject. It's not out in the world, it's inside here, inside somebody's mind. So it's internal, it's up to the individual, it's inside of us. And you don't see it in other areas. Like if I'm at a street corner and a friend of mine is on the street corner and he starts to step out while he's gabbing to me and he steps out into the street and I say, hey, watch out, there's a car coming. He's not going to say, well, that's just your truth. Right? I mean, he's going to look around. And I'm either lying or I'm telling him the truth or whatever. I'm trying to save his life. Okay, so people don't seem to argue as much about truth or have this fuzzy, nebulous idea of truth in certain areas of life, like going to a doctor or whatever it is. But you especially see it in the areas of morality. People have given up on truth in that area and religion and aesthetics. I just came across something, it was just a couple days ago. I don't know if I can find it fast. Oh. World Economic Forum official, a guy named Paul Smyk. He was trying to explain why there was some kind of conference that they were holding and the Russians were kicked out because of what they've done in Ukraine, but the Chinese were not kicked out, despite what they've done to the Uyghurs and all their terrible human rights abuses. This is this guy trying to justify why the Chinese are there, but the Russians are not there. He said, one person's definition of a bad guy is another person's definition of a good guy. So I'm not describing any nation that way. I'm just saying that depending on what your perspective is, you can agree and disagree about another country with its policies and so on. It's a fine line, he says. So I thought that was interesting. It's like, here we go, right? We're hearing this all the time. But it's actually around us in a lot of different forms. It's in philosophy, it's in ethics, it's in education. Good heavens, postmodernism. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's like now, what do you bring to the text, not what the author originally wanted you to know. So all of a sudden that text is actually about LGBTQ rights, or it's about feminism, or whatever it is, even though the author had no plan to talk about that, right? It's just a subjective way of dealing with that literature. Michael?
Yeah, and I've read that truth has become a trigger, and it's actually, a sign of white supremacy, it's racist, the very concept of truth. Yeah, that's where we're going. It's certainly in religion. Oh, you've got your religion, that's true for you. We'll talk about some of these a little bit later. It's in aesthetics. Beauty is in the eye of what? Beholder, right? You hear that a lot. By the way, is some of modern art about the ugliest stuff you've ever seen? It's like, because they've lost the concept of God and morality and these other things, then anything goes and they call it art. It's just really discouraging. But maybe that's just me.
You'll see it under different guises. You know, for example, it will be called moral relativism when you're talking about morality and what's right and what's wrong. You'll hear religious pluralism talk. We're going to cover some of these tonight. We don't have time to do them all, but you know, religious pluralism, multiculturalism. Again, there's nothing wrong with having a bunch of different cultures. I mean, look at the room here. This is great. We've got people from different cultural backgrounds. That's not where the multicultural people want to land, though. They're going to say something a little different. And then tolerance, got a new definition for tolerance, so we'll talk about that. And then there, I mentioned postmodernism, and then there's something called scientism. And darn it, just because of time, I'm not going to cover that tonight, but maybe we can get to it some other time. Or if you're curious, let me know, and I'll send you an outline on scientism. It's not science, it's scientism. It's a philosophy. Okay, so we're not going to cover that. We're going to do these 4 tonight in about 20, 25 minutes. So like I said, this is 30,000 feet, right? We're going kind of over the basics. So again, I will give you notes that'll be way more complete in case you say, gee, that doesn't seem thorough. Well, it's not. That's not the point. I'm just trying to give you like foundational things as we go through this material. So moral relativism. Right and wrong are determined either by you as an individual or maybe it's your society. Anybody see a problem with that? That's what I'd like to do, is introduce these 4 areas and then find out. I'll put a list up here myself, what I think are some of the problems, but I bet you've thought about it as well. Well, do you see any problem with this view of morality, that it's inside or...
Forever changing.
Yeah, I mean, what was like...
Is it
moral
Rick?
To me, Nick.
Nick, okay, I got close.
But like, what's moral to me, maybe it's like maybe me killing somebody for some purpose that I deem moral is relatively moral for me, but that's completely up to my subjective view, and that's not the subjective view at all.
Yeah. What were you saying, Chris?
Forever changing.
Forever changing. Yeah.
If you can get enough people to agree, you can justify anything. Slavery.
Yeah.
Subjective.
Hi, Bridget. Did I see you listed somewhere as winning a doubles?
Yes.
Okay, you want to brag for a second?
Yes.
She was in...
Actually, I beat Francie Overstreet's daughter. It's pickleball.
I guess that's what I saw, is Francie Overstreet. So anyway, so she's a pickleball champ here.
Yeah.
Michael?
So if truth is relative in this sense, then Nazi Germany did nothing wrong.
Right.
Exactly. You know, I think I mentioned this last week, about the best thing that you want to do is bring up the Germans, right? Bring up the Nazis in these arguments, because nobody's going to stand up for the Nazis or Adolf Hitler. And that's my first point. You can't say Hitler was wrong, right? Use Hitler. Use little kids and the Nazis. That'll get your argument off to a great start, really, depending on what you're arguing about. But who's going to say Hitler is all right? Well, he thought he was okay, and they voted him into office. So the whole society thought he was okay. And then they come along and they go to war, they lose the war, and at the Nuremberg trials, what did the Nazis say? You're just imposing your justice on us because you won the war. And they had to think, why are we prosecuting these people? Because that's true, right? That's if you don't buy into utter morality, if this is some kind of subjective stuff, then why are we prosecuting? So they had to come up with something they call natural law that was beyond the nation. And then they say, no, you didn't meet this standard of morality. So it's kind of interesting. So you can't say Hitler was wrong. There are no immoral laws. Why are people complaining about slavery, for heaven's sakes? There's no immoral law. If that's what the group wanted to do, there you go. How about this one? Does this bother anybody? You take William Wilberforce and you take Martin Luther King and Gandhi and you take all these other people that we would normally put on stamps and we honor them and we give days off, holidays, and talk about them in school and praise them. Why are we praising them? Right? They were moral reformers, but that makes no sense if you've got a society that says do your own thing. There's your morality. They're actually, in fact, they're being immoral, aren't they, by bucking the system? You ever think about it that way? Think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany. He's bucking the system. We honor him, but why would we honor him if this is the situation here where it's moral relativism? There's no moral progress, by the way. We would like to think that our country is better than it was 50 years ago with lynchings and whatever. We'd like to think we're better than we were 100 years ago with slavery and things like that. But you can't say that because it's all moral relativism, which means things change, but they don't get better. The minute you use the word better, you got some kind of standard out there that everybody's supposed to buy into, but you're not, there's no standard out there that you can say, hey, look, we're better than we were 50 years ago. You can't be what they call, not prescriptive, proscriptive. You can't tell people, you can't use words like should and not, can you? The minute you go up to somebody and you say, hey, knock that off, you shouldn't do that, what's their response going to be if they're moral relativists? Yeah, you're judging them, and says who?
Who are you to tell me?
Yeah, who are you to tell me? Exactly. And there you go, you're kind of stuck. There's a great essay, and if you want, I can send you the essay. It gets kind of, you know, I could send you just a summary of it, but it's a guy named Arthur Leff, L-E-F-F, and he was a law professor back at Yale. And he wrote a whole article called Says Who, and he says, we've tried, government after government has set up different ways to run their society to make people be good. And he said, every one of these has failed because if it's moral relativism, somebody can always say, so what? You know, who are you to tell me what to do? And he said, we're stuck. If there's no God, which I don't think he believed there's a God, if there's no God, we're stuck. Because there's no right and wrong that we all ought to follow.
So there would be no consequences either.
Right.
So
Yeah,
there's no,
exactly.
like, if you do this and this, you're in jail, or you get a punishment. So.
Yeah, that goes away, doesn't it? Here we go, one more time. I'm going to hit this more than once tonight. These statements, we have to live in God's world, and God set us up inside a certain way. And we can't live these so-called philosophies of life. And if you meet a moral relativist, steal their car temporarily. But just ask for the car keys. So they're going to say, wait a minute, you can't steal my car. I say, why not? That's my standard. You got your standard, I got mine. I like to take things from other people. Where are the keys? Yeah. So you've got a problem there. There's going to be hypocrisy. You step in front of them in a line someplace, they're going to say, hey, don't do that. You can say, that's the way I work. What's your problem? What about things that are just huge and awful that have gone on for centuries and all? The big issues of life that people get so worked up about. But if you ever meet a moral relativist who complains about these things, guess what? All they can say is, I don't like it. They can't say it's wrong because it's just not their standard, it's somebody else's standard. But here we go again. If everybody gets to make up their own standard, then these things are not wrong, they just don't happen to like them. Kind of like flavors of ice cream. Well, nobody feels like this is a flavor of ice cream. This is awful. This should never be happening. They can't really use that word evil. Because think about that. If you say evil, you're saying there is that standard someplace. It's not just personal likes and dislikes. It's something that is terribly wrong. Any thoughts or questions about that before we move on to the second point? So that's moral relativism. I told you it's going to go fast. Tracy?
I know that they would justify it with an argument along the lines of, well, we make up our laws that do the most good for the most people. And there's a counter to that, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's utilitarianism.
That it's well, who decides what good is for those people?
Yeah, you're using moral terms like good. And slavery, frankly, was probably good for the majority of Americans. Right? So we want that. Is that okay? Hitler and Mussolini had the trains running on time. You know, but of course, if you're a gay or if you're whatever, if you're a gypsy, if you're a Jew, right, it wasn't so good for them, but it worked for a lot of people. Yeah, so this utilitarian argument is pretty grim if you think you're going to base your morality on that. Okay, so I'll move on. Here's a second issue, religious pluralism. So what we're not saying is just acknowledging people having different religions. That's not the problem. Nobody's going to get upset about that. But what happens is people are pushing it pretty far now, and they're saying, well, since there's no real truth, there's no difference between these different religions. Buddhism, good for you. Hinduism, good for you. Mormonism, good for you. Whatever it is, that's good. That's just as good as all the others, right? You can put an equal sign in front of all these different religions. And sometimes we get told this story. You know where I'm going with this one?
Oh, yeah.
It's called The Blind Man and the Elephant story. So the story is that a long time ago in some village in India, It's a small village, and they bring this elephant through. People hadn't seen an elephant. Some blind people in the village say, oh, I want to experience an elephant too. So they bring them out. Remember, they haven't seen the elephant before. So somebody grabs the tusk and says, oh, it's like a spear. But you got a person over here that's looking at the side of it, says, what do you mean a spear? It's like a wall. And somebody else says it's like a column, as they grab the leg, and somebody else pulling on the tail, probably not a wise idea, pulls on the tail and says, it's like a rope. Somebody else has got the trunk, and they're arguing. It's getting louder and louder, and finally the mayor of that little village comes out and says, you're hurting my ears, knock it off. You all just have a piece of the truth, but you don't have the full picture. So guess who the blind people are? The religious. Anybody see a problem with that story? It doesn't really prove what they think it proves. They'd like to say it shows religious pluralism, that the Hindus have a little piece of the truth, the Buddhists have a little piece of the truth, Catholics have a little piece of the truth, and on and on. That's what it's supposed to teach us. What's the problem with that story?
There can only be one truth.
What's that?
There can only be one truth. You can't have 6 or 7 different truths, right? There's
Well,
only one truth.
but every person did have kind of the truth, right? I mean, they knew the part of the elephant was like a column or a pillar or something. No?
It's the mayor. The mayor, you don't know what the mayor believes in, right? The mayor is going to be the Christian that sees the whole thing.
No, the mayor is going to be the... Go ahead, Al. What were you going to say?
Well, there is the elephant, and while each of them has a piece of an elephant, they don't have the elephant.
Yeah, they don't have
There is
the...
a whole elephant. There is a truth.
There's something different about the mayor of the town and these blind people, right?
The mayor can see.
The mayor can see...
And so you're saying that there's somebody that recognizes each of those pieces for what it is. So you're establishing an authority. Well, how do you know that each one has a piece of the truth unless there's someone that can say, no, this is what the reality is. This is, someone to provide context for each of the pieces.
Yeah, it's pretty... I'm just going to use one word here. It's arrogant. Because what is it saying? I have a bigger picture of reality than you do. All you poor slobs that are going to this church or that church, you're part of this religion, you're part of that religion, you're all very limited in your view. Whereas I have a godlike view of everything, right? I can tell where the Hindu is or the whatever. I've got a bigger picture of reality than you do. Really? How did this person get sight and the rest of us are blind? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. There are other problems with it, by the way. It does, and you've touched on it, I think, here already. It treats religions as if there's no difference between them. Really?
True.
What are some different religious views of Jesus?
Prophet.
Prophet, just a nice guy, but a prophet. That'd be the Muslim approach.
Teacher.
Nice, moral teacher.
Is he the brother of Satan?
Yeah, Mormons
That's a good
Mormons have him as the spirit brother of Satan. Anything else that they... for the Jehovah's Witnesses, he's the second... he's the created person after God, right? You got God the Father, but then he created Jesus, so he's a created being. So you've got all these different views. Can Jesus be all of those things? That doesn't make any sense. How is he the Messiah and not the Messiah? The Jews say he's not the Messiah, the Christians say he is. He can't both not be the Messiah and be the Messiah. So somebody that's saying, this picture of the blind man, the elephant, oh, that's so true. No, it's not, because it makes it sound like we're all blind. We don't have any insights at all. How about the method of salvation? Do all religions agree how you get yourself saved? If you're a Buddhist, you're trying to get rid of this earthly body, and you go off and you lose individuality. You become a drop in the ocean, right? So you totally lose yourself if you're a Buddhist. That's not what Christians say happened. For the Japanese, I forgot, I think it was Shintoism, that you come back as like a spirit and you're in a tree, or so I mean, you got all these different views. You can't do all of that stuff. Something will happen, but what, you just go in the ground and rot? Okay, that's a possibility, but you can't rot and go to heaven and have your sins weighed by Allah, and you can't do all of those things. That's impossible. How about the characteristics of God? Do we have different views of God among these different religions? Of course. So how can God be a three-in-one God and not be a three-in-one God? He's either three-in-one or he's not, or he's something different, but he can't be all those things. Any questions about the religious pluralism? By the way, there's another, I'll have to keep moving here, but there's another story that's told us, and that is that there's this huge mountain at the top is God, and all the religions can't see each other, but they're all working up at the edge of the mountain. It's the same problem that the other story is, which is somebody's in the helicopter and can see all of this, but we're too stupid, right? The Christians are on this narrow path, and they can't see that the Muslims are over here and the Buddhists are over here. So it's the same issue. So maybe you'll hear that story instead. Okay, here's the third one, multiculturalism. And again, I'm not complaining, and Christians don't complain that there are different cultures, right? That's not what we're talking about here. But there's a position within multiculturalism that gets pretty extreme. It says all cultures are equal in value. All cultures are equal in value. Any thoughts about that? Do you see any problem with that?
Nazi Germany.
Nazi Germany, there you go, bring in the Nazis.
They still have the caste system in India.
Yeah, exactly. I want to touch on that in just a second. Did you hear she was talking about the caste system in India? You got those untouchables? So you stepped around them. Mother Teresa didn't step around them, right? She took in the ones that were the outcasts. That was a very different approach. Were you going to say something, Michael?
Yeah, a cannibal society is not one I'd want to live in.
No, not good. Do you ever read Peace Child? Peace Child is such a wonderful book by Don Richardson. He's going to, it's Indonesia or someplace over there, and he's working with this tribe, and he tells them the story of Jesus. And they have a very different view of the way life works. And so he tells them the story about Judas turning in Jesus and ratting on him and stuff. And he thinks he's got this story told well, and those people say, we like Judas. He said, what? They love the idea of revenge in that society. They love to treat somebody well, but you're going to stick it to them eventually, and then you get them when they're defenseless, and then you let them have it. So it's like, wow, a very different society. Yeah, so problems with the view. You can't distinguish between the good and the bad societies, and we've already talked about India, the caste system. Do you know what sati is? You heard about that?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tracy.
If it's what I think it is, it's when the husband dies, the wife is put to death as well.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
She's burnt.
Burned, yeah. Now, many of them would say, I'm not going to do that, so they wouldn't necessarily, go chase them down and tie them up and throw them on. But if they refuse to do that, they're an outcast the rest of their lives. So really, there's no difference between societies, the way women are treated in our society. How about women in Islam? I hate to pick on Islam, but I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Women there are definitely second-class citizens. There's still female genital mutilation going on in Islamic countries. I would say there's a huge difference for the sexes between Islamic society and our society. Some cultures, frankly, have contributed more to the world. I'll just leave it at that. We won't take the time to look that up. I think it's really hard to argue that every culture has done something equally for the world. I mean, Tracy brought it up here. If you say every culture is pretty much the same, here we go. So the Nazis are no different than our society? Anarchists, blow everything up and see what's left? Really? I came across something the other day that really struck me. I read comments from the English Prime Minister about 10 years ago, the French Prime Minister from about 8 or 9 years ago, and the German Chancellor, what do they call her? Is that Chancellor? German? I think so. They had quotes from all three of them. And you know what they said? We welcome other societies, but this whole pluralism thing has gone nuts. This multiculturalism thing has gone nuts, because they didn't say it that way, but they're much more polite. But they said basically what's happening is we're balkanizing our society. And you know what I'm talking about, balkanizing, like the Eastern Europe, where you got these little countries and they fight each other all the time. So the English would open their arms and allow these different cultures to come in, but the cultures never assimilated. They stayed their culture. They stayed their culture. In fact, I've heard in some places Islamic groups are such that they don't want the police to come in. They say, we'll police ourselves, thank you very much. And so you can start to see that's happening, and these societies are kind of going, wait a minute, this isn't really what we wanted. We wanted to be open and we certainly think other cultures are fine, but when they come in and then they don't want to connect to your society, what are you doing? You're turning in little bits of other countries that are now part of your country. I think it destroys confidence in your own society as well. How can you ask somebody to go fight for your country in the service or something like that if there's no difference between your society and the ones you're fighting? You used to hear that all the time. I don't know if some of you are old enough, but when the Soviets were in power, everybody kept coming up with moral equivalencies between our society and their society. I always thought that was crazy. Their society is no way as good as our society. And we're seeing the results of that with Putin and what's going on with Ukraine. Any questions about that, the multicultural? Let's talk about tolerance for just a minute here. Remember, it used to be, I don't agree with you, so I will tolerate you because we live in an open society. That's just the way we're supposed to work, be nice to each other. You can't tolerate somebody unless you disagree with them. Right? If you agree totally with somebody else, you're not tolerating them. They're a friend or whatever, but that's not toleration. At least that's not the way it used to be seen. What about now? You tolerate every belief because remember, we're all talking truth here. If truth disappears, that we can't agree on truth, then, well, I guess you have to tolerate it because everybody's got that little bit of truth that they think is their truth, and you got your truth, somebody else got their truth. So how do we all get along? Well, we just tolerate everything. And that's the new view. In fact, Christians are often called intolerant.
Well, in addition to that, though, if you don't agree, there are negative consequences. You used to be able to sit down, disagree, let's sit down over coffee and talk about it. But now, if you don't agree with my crazy views, I'm going to crucify you.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to cover here. We can't disagree anymore. We're supposed to all nod our heads when somebody comes up with a real strange view of things because we're supposed to tolerate it. So how do you get things done in a democratic society that depends on coming together and compromising or looking at different views and deciding what's the strength of one and the weakness of another? You can't do that anymore. Yeah.
There's been a big shift.
Is it Richard?
Paul.
Paul. Wow. Okay.
We used to tolerate people, but not ideas. Now we tolerate any idea, but we don't tolerate people.
It's upside down, huh? This is what Tracy was talking about. It's self-refuting because these people that talk so much about toleration, they don't tolerate you if you disagree with them. I just said it's a one-way street. You better agree with them because if you say, hey, that's not truth or that's not morality or that's not the way I see it, yeah, you're in trouble. You get really nailed for that in our society. It can't be lived, can it? I don't know anybody that's tolerant of everything. Good heavens. Who's going to be tolerant of a racist or a liar or a cheat or a thief or whatever it is? You look at that, of course we're intolerant of things. Josh McDowell has a book out. He calls it The Beauty of Intolerance. Isn't that funny? But it's okay to be intolerant. It depends what we're intolerant about, but we're all intolerant. It fosters a lot of hypocrisy, doesn't it? You ever notice that? I don't know if that's happened to you, but you come out of a meeting, if there's a bunch of people at work or someplace, and you find out later, people disagreed about what was said there, but they didn't want to open their mouths. So there's a lot of, you nod your head when you think this is crazy, but you don't want to bring it up because you're going to get nailed. So you got a lot of hypocrisy. It's really not very respectful of people. Look what it's really doing. It's really saying, that's a dumb idea, but I don't want to tell you it's a dumb idea because I think you're too fragile to handle it. So we just let them run on with these bad ideas. That's not really very loving to people, is it? To just say, this will lead to a terrible life, this is going to lead to some terrible consequences, but go right ahead. Okay, well, if you love somebody, you care about people, you can say, I'm going to have to confront that. That doesn't make any sense. That's not going to lead to human flourishing. It creates a tyranny of the individual. And I'm not going to take the time tonight. I'm just going to mention it real briefly. But there was a letter to the editor in the San Diego Union Tribune a few years back. It was a teacher in Encinitas at an elementary school, I think it was. She had, this is near Christmas time, she had a little Christmas tree on her desk, and it had frog ornaments, nothing to do about Jesus, no crosses, none of that stuff, just frog ornaments. And the principal called her in and said, we'd like you to get rid of that tree. And she said, why? She said, the Supreme Court says trees and creches and things like that are okay because it's kind of part of the secular season. He said, well, one student complained. And she said, so? And he said, why would you make one kid unhappy? And she said, that was the time I decided I was going to retire.
Yeah, she's done.
So, I mean, we're getting to the point of all it takes is one person to raise a stink about something, and then everybody has to bow to that. Get ready. Things are going to not get better. If crazy ideas are allowed to go, then they're going to run amok, aren't they? Incest, whatever it is. We haven't seen the end of strange behaviors.
Real quick.
Yeah.
So, with the Grammy Awards, I don't know how many of you heard about a guy named Sam Smith did a number where he played Satan and everyone was kind of worshiping Satan. And apparently CBS had tweeted, "We're ready to worship."
Oh, really?
They're right in our face these days. Right in our face.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So let's take like 5 minutes here. Just give me 5 more minutes and we'll move on. The other one's going to be much shorter on the existence of God. But what do we do about this? I mean, all we're doing is at this point complaining. But first thing is, what did Paul say if you're going to have a full armor of God? Get that truth belt on, right? So we've got to realize there is truth and we have to confront when we're out there. Here's the good thing. I mentioned this earlier. Reality's on our side. We're built a certain way as human beings. We have the image of God. We've got the conscience that God gave us. And you can't live these oddball ideas. We know there are rights and wrongs. We all feel like if somebody's doing something wrong, we should be able to talk to them in a kind way, but we feel that would help them if we could straighten them out. We all feel guilt because it's not just that we've got an odd moral character ourselves. We feel like we're falling short of some standard out there. We all feel that. Finding truth within is a really frustrating thing. I mean, I see that with my students at Palomar. Kids are being told over and over again, make your own truth. Right? There's nothing out there. They're not taught morality anymore. Just you generate it yourself. Well, that's a lot of responsibility. What if a kid is having a hard time finding his or her way to the truth that will work for him or her? We've got a high suicide rate among the kids. We've got depression is just shooting off the charts because they're told, you've got to create meaning. And it's hard for kids to do that. Where's meaning? There's nothing for them to hang on to. The ground is gone. They're just kind of hanging in midair. We can know truths, can't we? We can use moral common sense. Think about how the Declaration of Independence went. We hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. They said, we don't have to prove this truth to you. You know it. It's inside you. It's self-evident. There's logic, and we talked about this before, the law of non-contradiction. There either is or there's not a God. There can't be both of these things. Right? Jesus can't be the Messiah and not be the Messiah. Just observation. Reality is a stable kind of thing. You can go out and you can find out a lot of truths just by interacting with the world. I thought this was kind of funny. I don't know, it depends who your friend is and how well you know the person, but it's called push their hot button. So let's say you've got a friend that's really fired up about any of these issues. Maybe it's the environment. J.P. Moreland tells a funny story. He said he was he's a Christian author, a philosopher. He said he was interacting with somebody one time who was really big on the environment. So he said, hey, why don't you come with us? A bunch of buddies and I go out on a lake every once in a while. We take a couple of sticks of dynamite and we go out on the lake and we have a hat and we all throw $5 into the hat. Then we toss the dynamite out there and we make guesses over how many dead fish are going to float to the surface. He said the guy's eyes were just huge. And he said, no, we don't really do it. But I mean, notice what happened. The guy, all of a sudden, he's not a relativist anymore. It's like, you shouldn't do that. Right? So all of a sudden, there's a rule for J.P. Moreland as well as for this guy. Instead of, if he's a relativist, he ought to say, well, that's good for you then. Yeah.
Yeah, even this is like another secular standpoint of finding truth. It's like Immanuel Kant, philosopher, and you have the categorical imperative, and it like has like 3 different sets to it. It's you universalize everything. Everybody does it all around the world. You maximize it. You do it to the fullest extent, and then you do it all the time. It's the third one, and that's how you judge if it's moral. I'm just going to use the subject of being homosexual, and you see that's beneficial for the population. So you universalize it. Everybody around the world is gay. And you maximize it. You're gay all the time. And is that beneficial? It's no, because the population is not going to survive beyond that. So it's kind of like another little...
Yeah, another way to judge. Yeah, that's interesting. Be ready for name calling. It's already happening, and Jan, you were talking about that. You're going to hear things like, the minute you talk about truth, then you're going to hear, hey, you're a homophobe or you're intolerant, that's a biggie. Any response you can think of if you do get name called because you think there is real truth out there? No?
Well, if they tell you you're being intolerant, you just look at it and go, well, are you being tolerant?
I thought you were supposed to get along with everybody. Why? Yeah, sometimes you can flip these things back on the person. You can do this too, you can just say so. Because all you're doing at that, I say all you're doing, all the person is doing this name calling is putting a label on you. That's called ad hominem. They're not dealing with the issue, right? They haven't, whatever the issue is, homosexuality or anything, they're not dealing with the issue. They're just slapping a label on you and think that wins the argument. That doesn't win an argument. That's like kicking somebody in the shins. That doesn't win an argument. Right? It's avoiding an argument, in fact. We can ask questions. I bet some of you know where I'm going with this. Okay, if you guys are laughing, you know where I'm going. What do you mean, or how'd you arrive at that conclusion? Everybody needs this book. It's Greg Kogel's book called Tactics. It's how to maneuver in conversations, not how to trick people, but just how to get through a conversation and have your position treated seriously. And he goes through all sorts of illustrations. What if you're dealing with this kind of person? What if you're dealing with that kind of person? This is the 10th anniversary edition, so if you have a chance, it's newer, it's about a third thicker. I mean, he's added a lot of material to it. So excellent book.
What's the title?
Tactics. I'll give you a handout later. I'll send it in the mail, and it's got the book on there, Tactics. How do you know what you believe is true?
That's why we're here.
And then how about practice? There are ways that we can practice. I already mentioned Kokel's book, but there are plenty of good books. Did you get that 4-page resource that I sent out? Okay, because I gave it to you in sections, like science or whatever. And if it's too overwhelming, just let me know and I can point you to 2 or 3 that might be good in a particular area. Watch some debates sometime. And you can pause it. What's nice about YouTube, you pause it and you say, how would I have answered that? We did that one time with our class years ago. We had a DVD, and it was Frank Turek and Christopher Hitchens. And they were arguing about the existence of God. And it was really fascinating to watch. But we kept stopping it, saying, okay, what do you think would be a good response to this? Or how would you answer this? Right? So that might be kind of interesting to do. Some other steps, just speak up. We're letting the wrong people run everything. They're all saying these things, and we're not responding. Maybe just get personal so we can get to know people instead of just shouting at them on a street corner. Keeping a clear message. And then there are plenty of good groups that support Christians and what they're doing. Anybody know about ADF, Alliance for Defending Freedom? That's a great organization. They have lawyers that will go to court to protect the rights of free speech or whatever it is. Christian bakers that don't want to do a cake for a gay wedding or anything like that. ADF is the go-to place, and they offer free legal advice. They'll take it clear up to the Supreme Court. FRC is the Family Resource Center, and there are plenty more. I mean, I'm just touching on them. But some good places that you might want to throw a few dollars at once in a while. And of course, the number one thing we can do is pray. I think maybe as a wrap-up here for this first part, this really hit me a long time ago when I came across it for the first time. I'd felt a real burden, that every time I got in a conversation, I had to change that person. But that's nuts. I mean, it's up to God, and all God wants us to do is to be faithful. Just put the seed out there, just get the word out, and then He'll work on it with that person. We don't have to be the the one that changes that life. We may not. We may never see a change in that life. But that's okay. Our job is just to be there and to present the truth. Tracy?
Another way of looking at it, a little cliche, but I think there's some truth to it, is that when we practice, we may not necessarily change them, but it's going to keep them from changing us.
Oh, that's a good way of putting it, yeah. Good point. Yeah. And then last thing here is, I just put, focus on the good that you want for our society. I think sometimes Christians go up to somebody and say, well, the Bible says, so therefore you ought to do it. Well, yeah, the Bible says it, but why does the Bible say it? Because it's good for the human race. And so there are good ways to live and there are bad ways to live. And that's where that Family Research Center, they've done all sorts of surveys and studies, and they've looked at all sorts of places to say, what's the best way for human beings to function? Well, we're built in such a way that certain activities and things are good for us and others are terrible. So we're not saying we don't like what you do. We're saying this is going to end up in a tragedy for your life. It's going to lead to a more unpleasant, unhappy, unhealthy life than the other way. So it's not just that Christianity is, I feel good about it, but it's good for the human race. Okay, so I'll send you out, because I don't have time now, but I'll send you out a list of questions that you might want to consider when you're dealing with somebody that'll make them think a little bit more about this issue, so I'll do that later. So I like this conclusion. Ben Shapiro, Sharon got that for me. There's no such thing as your truth, there's the truth in your opinion. Okay, I thought that made sense. Okay, so second part here, we can do it. It's going to go fast, but this is easier, frankly, I think. Dealing with all these abstractions is a little tougher. I love science. I love anything to do with astronomy. And so this is right down this is like a fun thing for me here for the last part of the class. I'm always surprised how few Christians really have great arguments for the existence of God. They'll say, well, he speaks to me, or he's in my heart, or the Bible talks about it. And that's great. I mean, I expect those things to happen. But if you're talking to a person who doesn't buy into the Bible, doesn't buy into, well, that's just your experience, or you like to go to church and sing songs on Sunday, well, good for you. It makes you feel good to have this daddy in the sky looking out for you, right? I mean, they can kind of blow you off with any of these things. So I don't want to do that tonight. I want to look at 4 things, and there are a bunch more. But we're going to talk about 4 arguments for the existence of God, and there they are. There are others, but again, just the highlights for tonight. So how about the start of the universe? This is supposed to illustrate the Big Bang, which is the current accepted model, that at one time there was nothing. And then all of a sudden, all matter, space, time, and energy comes into existence. And this is showing it expanding. We're in the middle of an expanding universe right now. Why is that okay for Christianity? And a good argument for God?
It jives with Genesis 1:1.
Sounds like Genesis, doesn't it? It says, in the beginning, God created it all. In other words, if you bring into existence all matter, space, time, and energy, that's nature. Well, the universe can't bring itself into existence. It needs something outside of nature, because something can't cause itself. So you've got a supernatural, it has to be by definition, a supernatural cause, something outside of nature to bring this in. Well, I think what's so funny about this was, when this was proposed back in the 1920s and 30s, several scientists spoke out. They were really unhappy with this because it seemed to suggest there was something that started it all. Who or what would start the universe? Well, Einstein, for example, he created a set of equations that were fudge factors so that it looked like the universe had always been here. Later he said that was the stupidest thing he ever did, because he didn't like the idea of a starting point. There's a guy named Eddington, he's a very famous British physicist. He said the idea of the start of a universe was repugnant. Now think about that, a scientist who says basically, ew, I don't like this. That's not science, right? I mean, either the theory is right or it's wrong. He should have said, well, I think there's some problems with it. He didn't say, he said, it's repugnant to me. That cracked me up. I mean, a scientist saying he didn't like it.
Richard Lawton, with his famous statement about we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes they kind of open up and you find out what's going on behind the curtain there. Yeah.
I think one of the things that hits me the most about the Big Bang Theory, it throws the theory of of Darwin right out the door, because a lot of the things he put forth, it takes over time. There's all kind of time. Well, now there isn't. It's Big Bang and coming forward from that.
That's a really good point, yeah. There isn't really enough time for evolution to do its thing.
And also, the Big Bang is so illogical because you're saying that everything that is in order and is beautiful and perfectly constructed came from destruction and chaos and explosion. And it doesn't make sense. You shake up something and it's all in pieces, and when you throw it out, it's still all in pieces. So,
Are you talking about the Big Bang?
right.
So you're saying that doesn't make sense?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But,
That is a good argument.
Well, I think the idea there is that God used the Big Bang in order to get things going, and then that he continued to work, that he designed the universe in such a way, created it so that over that period of time, he continued to work, mold, craft, and create life, and to create the complexity and the beauty that we see
He
today.
had 5 days left too.
Well, are you equating the Big Bang with Jesus or God speaking?
yeah, yeah. We'll come back to that in just a second. Let me add a couple of things. It's a well-tested theory. By the way, and this maybe ties into what Bridget's talking about, this is not like a hand grenade going off. I mean, that's not, you know, it's got the name Big Bang. That was a joke name that somebody who didn't like the theory came up with. It's a careful expansion. If the universe expanded any more slowly than it's expanding, it would stay one big chunk of hydrogen, right? It wouldn't separate off and do like planets and suns and us, right? So it's got to expand. If it expands too fast, all the material flies apart, and again, you don't get stars, you don't get planets, you don't get us. So this is not a bang like you think of, you know, with parts flying everywhere. This is a carefully crafted event. So maybe that helps to think about it that way. And then once you get the bang going, then things start collecting, right? The stars collect, and you get Earths and different planets and stuff like that. It's not a threat to Christianity. Okay, so I don't know where you fall on the age of the earth stuff and you know, how God created. This is way before that anyway, so it doesn't really have anything to do with the 5, 6, 7 days of Genesis. Just boom, you got everything, and then when did God intervene? That's up to, you know, a lot of different theories at that point. So, start of the universe. What about the start of life? 100 years ago, people took their microscopes, they looked at cells, and they go, that looks pretty simple. I bet you could get that going pretty easily. You just throw some chemicals together in a little muddy pool somewhere, hit it with a strike of lightning, and the chemicals come together. Come on, you got life, and there you go. Because all it looked like was a sack of protoplasm with this little chunky thing in the middle called a nucleus, and it'd pull apart once in a while, and they'd look at that and go, cool. Simple, pretty easy. Darwin thought it was pretty simple stuff. Well, Michael Denton, who's a biochemist, says the complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it's impossible to accept. He says that could have been thrown together by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. He said, in fact, if it happened, it wouldn't be any different than a miracle. Yeah, you're right, Michael. Right? It's a miracle. He says it's a miracle. Well, now, look at this. This is what they're discovering thanks to advances in microscopes and electron microscopes. This is what's going on inside the cell. It's incredible. It's way more complicated than they expected. How in the world do you get something like that to just come together because of a lightning strike in a muddy pool someplace? Trace?
One of the skeptics' favorite lines is to say, we're learning new things all the time. We're at least honest to say we don't know yet.
Yeah.
There's that presumption that one day we will know. Problem is, it's a double-edged sword because it's turning out that the more we know, the more we learn, how improbable it is that these things took place without some kind of an intervening intelligent agent.
Oh yeah, things are getting more complex that they're looking at on the small scale. Bridget?
Isn't one of the scientific principles also that life has to give life, that non-life cannot give life?
Yeah, right. Abiogenesis, they used to.
Yeah. Life
they,
comes from life. You can't have non-life produce
turning into life, yeah, exactly. But you know, they've been so optimistic because it looked so simple that back in the 1960s, they started something called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And they've been scanning the skies, looking at different galaxies and listening, right? Hello? Hello? Anybody out there? And they haven't heard a thing yet. Now again, Tracy is probably right. There are a lot of them that say, but we just haven't searched everything yet. Well, I find this quote coming up just amazing. I was reading, what was it? I think it was Astronomy magazine. And they were reviewing a book by a guy named Paul Davies. He's not a Christian. He's a very well-known astrophysicist. He writes books. He's kind of the Carl Sagan of today. He wrote a book called The Eerie Silence. Do you hear that? Eerie Silence. They're not hearing anything. Hello, anybody out there? And this is what he had to say. Now remember, this is coming from a non-Christian who doesn't really want this to be the case. But here's what he had to say. We're probably the only intelligent beings in the universe. And he says, I wouldn't be surprised if the solar system had the only life in the whole universe. You look out with these millions of stars and these clusters, these galaxies and stuff like that. And he says, I think we're it. It's that hard to get life going. They used to think any planet, you just have a sun out there and a planet somewhere and it's going to happen. No, they're not finding that to be the case at all. How about number 3? I think this is the best thing that you can argue with a non-Christian about as far as why we think there's a God, and that's design. Yeah. Design in the universe. That's a World War II submarine with a whole bunch of dials. I just want to get something with a lot of dials in there, because if you're on that sub and the dials start going the wrong place, you die, right? You're too deep, or the oxygen's gone, or something's terrible. So you've got a little narrow spot where that needle has to be on all of these gauges. Well, that's kind of like life for us. So I'll just give you one example. We'll just do the Earth. By the way, fine-tuning for life on Earth, they're up to over 400 things that have to be exactly right for us to have life. I'll just give you a few of them real fast here. The Earth has to be a certain distance from the galaxy center. We have to have the right kind of sun. The sun has to produce the right kind of particles that fly off of it. We have to be, and you know this, we have to be the right distance. Any further, we're too cold. Any closer, we're too hot. The tilt of the axis has to be just right so you can get seasons. It has to spin at a certain rate. If it's slower or faster, no good for us. It has to have the kind of magnetic field that's sort of like a shield, that guards us from things coming in, radiation. You have to have the right kind of crust, the right kind of atmosphere, seismic, volcanic. I mean, all this stuff has to be exactly right. And you can go on for 400 of these things that have to be exactly right. And they're finding a hard time deciding that this kind of stuff can go on anywhere else. That's part of what Paul Davies was talking about. Well, what about the whole universe? Is this only good for the Earth? No. The fundamental laws of physics, these kinds of laws, have to be exactly right as well. The needles have to be turned just right, or you don't get life. Right? So this is huge. So again, I've got another stack of things here that talk about the universe has to have exactly right things, velocity of light or whatever. The expansion rate, we already talked about that of the universe. What about design on the small scale? That's just as impressive. They didn't know this 100 years ago. This is a little bacteria with a little tail that's kind of like an outboard motor, and it spins around and sends that thing through water or whatever. That's what the little tail thing looks like. Now they've got better microscopes and they can actually see the pieces of it. This looks like General Motors, right? Or Toyota or something. This little flagella out there, that little whip, it goes 100,000 RPM, and then within a half a turn it can go backwards 100,000 RPM. Try that on the freeway doing 65, throw it into reverse. No, don't do it. But you can't do that with your car. This little guy can do it all day. Amazing. And then I sent you, did you see, anybody take a look at some of those little film clips I sent you about molecular motors? That one guy that sits there and he actually walks across those. He's walking. It's I look at that, I'm just amazed. You can see the little feet on this thing here. So they just carry stuff, and by the way, the microtubule forms they're not sitting there permanently as a roadway, right? They just come together so they can carry something somewhere, and then that little microtubule thing disassembles and goes somewhere else wherever it's needed. This is going on right now. We're all here. It's happening right now inside of us. Then you got DNA. Talk about design, right? Here's a chromosome and you pull it apart and it forms this DNA strand. So if you could see it and stretched out, it'd be like a ladder. Then you got 4 chemicals on the inside there, those different colors, A, T, C, and G. So if you split that ladder, pull it apart, then you got a little reader that comes along and it reads that sequence of those 4 different chemicals, and that's what builds you. Right? Then it goes out and builds proteins based on that, and there you go. Just like you have zeros and ones for your computing system, this time you got not 2 items, zeros and ones, you got 4 items. This is way more complicated. Bill Gates said this is the most complicated computer code ever. He knows computer code. Trace?
And also the amount of information that it's storing for the size. It's the densest form of information, more than any hard drive we've ever invented.
Yeah, it's like an encyclopedia for every one of your cells. Pretty amazing. And then the last one is the issue of morality. We look around at things that are just part of our universe and we say, well, we don't expect these things to behave morally. But what about people? We expect people to behave morally. Where are we getting this idea of morality? It doesn't appear to be out in the world. We're the ones that think there's something right and something wrong. So where are we getting these oughts, these things? Are we getting them from individuals? Yeah, but what if you go bowling with somebody that's never bowled before with you, and you go out and you bowl 2 balls, right, that's a frame, and you get 8 pins, so you write down 8, and that person steps up, throws it in the gutter, and jumps up and down and says, I get 50 points, all right, I'm way ahead. You go, wait a minute, that's not bowling. He says, sure it is, that's the way I bowl. Now what do? Right? That person bowls one way, you bowl another. You got to go to the rule book, or you go up to the counter and you say, do you have the list of rules? And then that rule is, of course, beyond you as the bowler and beyond your friend as the bowler. So there we go, right? If you don't do that, then you're stuck with this anarchy of 50 on a gutter bowl. Nobody can live with this individual morality, right? We've talked about that before. Steal from them. I just got to tell you a real quick story because I love this. There's a story of a professor who was teaching a class on ethics, and he had a student who said, we make it up as we go, right? Back to relativism. So a paper was due, and the student turns in the paper, and the professor gives it back in the next class. It has a big F on it, and the student's really irate. Goes into the office and says, we need to talk. And the professor says, sure. So the student says, didn't I make it the right length? Yeah. Didn't I format it correctly? Yeah. Didn't I have sources for the information? Yeah. Well, how come it's got an F? And the teacher said, because you turn it in a blue binder. I don't like blue. So he didn't really give him an F, but he just, he got the kid thinking, well, wait a minute. So maybe there is a standard, if I just let him have his standard and I have my standard, and he has the power, he's giving me a bad grade because he doesn't like something, even though it met all the qualifications. So, yeah, nobody lives by individual morality. Well, what about society? Maybe we have our morality thanks to society. Well, what level of society? The city or the state or the United Nations? I don't trust any of them. Whoops. We talked about that. The Nazis said, you just won the war, that's why you're imposing your morality on us. And they had to argue, no, there's a morality beyond. So what about God as the source? We need to have a God out there, otherwise we're not going to come up with morality, yet we do know down deep there is a morality beyond us. So that explains our guilt feelings. Here's a quick summary. If you can just remember, it's a 3-step summary, pretty simple. Every law has a lawgiver. Right? Nobody's going to argue about that. Every law's got a lawgiver. There is a moral law that's beyond each of us, and we have a fundamental sense of right and wrong. We're built that way. We say that's wrong, or that's good, or you should, or you shouldn't. Yes?
In San Francisco, LA, and Oakland, they have out-of-control sex parties right there on the street.
Yeah.
And so who's in charge of what's right and wrong there? They're making up their own right and wrong. There is no law.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Once you let people do it, we're in major trouble there. Here's the third part of this syllogism. Therefore, right, if every law has a lawgiver and we think there's a law beyond us, then there is a moral lawgiver. Who's that? It's God. Okay, so we were just building a cumulative case as far as the universe and start of life and things like that for the existence of God. I'll give you a bunch of resources that you can take a look at, a lot of resources. And then next week we'll talk about the Gospels and Jesus. Okay, so I'm running a few minutes late, but